And now to the holiday analysis of Shields and Brooks. Syndicated columnist Mark Shields and New York Times columnist David Brooks. Welcome. Happy holiday. All right, we had a healthcare vote yesterday. I'm from Boston. I want to try out my Boston Marathon analogy. Sometimes the winner comes through, arms waving, ready to run for more. Sometimes he or she just falls to the ground exhausted. What did you see yesterday?
There was a greater sense of relief than there was a celebration, but like winning the marathon, there's just a real and understandable, legitimate sense of accomplishment.
David?
Yeah, I mean, maybe since Woodrow Wilson, presidents have been trying to do this, certainly since Eisenhower. None have succeeded. Obama has succeeded or will succeed. And so that's politically a tremendous accomplishment. I would only point out that you haven't actually crossed the finish line of the marathon. You're in the first mile, and there's a lot to go.
So what is to come? I mean, now, of course, they have to get together with the House.
Yeah, I think that part they'll do reasonably well. I can't imagine anybody's going to hold this up here. The big issue between the House and the Senate is the financing of thing. The House has a provision which would have a surtax on millionaires. The Senate wants to pay for it through premium, high-cost health insurance premiums. I'd be stunned. The whole thing would fall apart if they didn't go with the Senate's measure. And that's substantively a good thing because the employer tax exemption for these insurance plans is fiscally insane and bad for the healthcare system because it subsidizes these Cadillac plans.
And Mark, I disagree. I disagree. I think that there will be a mix of financing. I think there will be a tax on individuals, and I think there will be a tax on the higher, the real Cadillac plans. I think to call the plans that many organized labor workers have and negotiated for Cadillac plans is a misnomer and an embellishment. But I also think that there will be a fight over the trigger on public option, and whether there will be. And I think there's a good chance they'll come out of it with a hard trigger if, in fact, the expenses of health care exceed the CBO estimates. I think there's a very good chance that that is acceptable to both sides.
But is the fight now, I mean, Republicans are quite clear. They're not there for anything, right? So the fight is among Democrats.
The fight is among Democrats and competing visions. The House bill covers more. It's more Democratic with a large D, traditionally speaking. It was a consensus coalition. You saw it put together in the Senate. Nancy Pelosi was shrewd enough as Speaker of the House to keep it all in her office. In the Senate, it was pretty open, pretty visible, and probably not what our teachers in Problems of Democracy of American Civilization had in mind in high school when they taught us.
Yes, but some of the things in the House bill are actually better than the Senate bill.
I agree.
There's the exchanges, which are national in the House bill, more competitive. But if they have a fight over this tax exemption, to me that would be a big deal. Because, first of all, I don't think you can pay for it, especially over 20 years, without the full tax on all those plans. That tax, because it's not really indexed for inflation, raises $1.3 trillion in the second 10 years. If they're going to say this balances the budget, that's just a ton of money they need, and they need to tax it all. And secondly, I think there's a consensus, at least among healthcare economists, you've got to raise taxes from within the healthcare system because nothing else will keep up with the rising costs. So if there really is resolve to fight this, especially on the part of the unions, and there probably is, that could make it trickier than maybe I anticipate.
So as we sit here at year's end, where does this fight, particularly this fight, leave the parties? One thing that happened this week was a defection from a Democrat to a Republican.
A freshman Democrat from northern Alabama, Huntsville, Alabama, Parker Griffith, who the Democrats have been a very competitive seat, a retiring Congressman Bud Kramer, who had been a Democrat, was a Democrat. The race succeeded. Both parties went in heavily. Democrats spent $1 million to win that seat. And anytime anybody leaves a party, and especially condemns the party or indicts his party on the way out, as he did, and joins the opposition, it's not insignificant. Mr. Griffith, who probably nobody had heard of before this week, tried to cast it in sort of moral terms, that it was a philosophical move.
That went over well with his colleagues.
Yeah, right? It's about self-preservation. I mean, it makes you yearn for the unvarnished candor of Arlen Specter, who when he left, Arlen Specter became a Democrat from Pennsylvania earlier this year. He conceded, very frankly, he couldn't win the Republican primary. He could not win in November as an independent, so he became a Democrat. Mm-hmm. There was no Paul on the road to Damascus, some epiphany he went through. And I think this is all about self-preservation. But the Democrats have become the majority party in the House of Representatives by winning seats that they weren't supposed to win in the border states and in the South. This, in this sense, it may not be a harbinger, but it's not good news for the Democrats.
Yeah, there are also a bunch of retirements on the Democratic side. All the signs that it's going to be a tough year for 2010 for Democrats, they're all out there. And, one suspects they won a lot of those seats in North Carolina and the South and near South. They're going to lose a ton of them, maybe 20 seats in those areas. And they're Democrats, and they're looking at political suicide in the face. I just wanted to say one larger thing about the parties and how they're reacting to this day. I really think this health care plan is just a huge event in our political history. And, the New Deal was a successful program. It created really Democratic majorities for a long time. The Great Society, on the other hand, created Republican majorities for a great long time. I think, however, this health care bill works out, it's going to have maybe not quite a seismic effect, but a huge effect. If it's a success, it'll become a sacred program, and Democrats will have a big thing to brag about. If it's a failure, we could be entering a Republican era.
You're not putting on the crystal ball to tell us how it's going to go.
I lean slightly one way, but I do think we should think of it in those terms.
Consequences are that big?
The consequences are enormous, and I think it will be a success. I mean, this has always been the difficult thing, and why it's a signal achievement for Harry Reid, for the Democrats in the Senate, for the Democrats in the Congress, in the House of Representatives, Nancy Pelosi, for the administration is this. This is an item, an issue that has never come to the floor for a vote under Richard Nixon, under Bill Clinton, under Harry Truman. Now it's passed both houses. That's important. But the important thing to remember is this. We passed Medicare in the middle of the 1960s, which was probably the apex of American confidence. We were doubling the nation's gross national product in that decade. I mean, it was just a sense of unlimited possibilities. To pass this major, major difference in a time of uncertainty, which itself produces uncertainty among people, 80% of whom have health care, 83% have health care, is a signal achievement to do that, because American confidence and optimism are among the low all-time lows.
They only did it with 35 or 45% support, depending on how you ask the question, with the majority opposing, which is a risky thing to do. And the other thing I'd say is, in the short term, whether you oppose the bill or support the bill, there is, I think even the supporters acknowledge, a short-term problem, which is a lot of the benefits don't kick in immediately, the taxes do. Second, you're going to have this increase in demand for health care without an increase in supply. That's probably going to drive up costs, at least in the short term. And so that's a political problem for 10 years.
All right, I want to get to, it's the end of the year, end of the first year for President Obama. So I want to talk a little bit about how you see his first year. Jim asked the president in that interview earlier this week. So let's take a look at the president's answer to get us started.
I think that we have managed an economic crisis of monumental proportions, 2 wars, a whole host of other challenges very well. I am entirely dissatisfied with where we are right now in terms of jobs, and the fact that families out there on the eve of Christmas are still really worried about being able to pay the bills or send their kids to college or have health care for themselves. And so I don't pat myself on the back at the end of this year. But what I do have confidence in is that we've made good decisions, that we've applied sound judgment to some very difficult situations, and that if we stay on a path where we are working hard, maintaining a sense of possibility for the future, we're willing not to defer tough decisions around health care or energy or education so that somebody else deals with them, that America will be strong again. And I think that I've shown this year that I can make hard decisions, even when they're not popular, and that I take a long view on these problems. And I frankly think that that's what America needs right now.
David? His assessment of himself and your assessment of him.
I more or less agree with him. I mean, the emphasis on the decision-making structure, the soundness of the decisions, the judgment, that's so quintessentially Obama. I mean, he's not talking about some impassioned thing for the crusade for the American people. It's about a very slow and deliberate decision-making process.
The process.
And he's got that. I give him credit for that. I mean, he's gotten some things they failed on. The Middle East peace process was a failure, a setback. Cap and trade is probably going nowhere. Financial regulations, Iran, that hasn't worked out. But on the other hand, as he says, we've come out of the worst of the financial problem. He did pass health care. He had a very sound process deciding Afghanistan. I would have to give him a B or B+, which is roughly the range he gives himself. And so I think you'd have to regard it as a successful year.
Mark?
Well, I mean, the president lays down the premise, which was that he did come to office at the time, arguably the worst economic time since the Great Depression, and with 2 wars, and a financial crisis of just historic proportions. And he's dealt with them. I mean, the fact that he got up every morning is probably impressive, and kept going, and still has his equanimity in his interview with Jim. But at the same time, he initiated 2 major objectives. I mean, healthcare is enormous, as is climate change. And I agree with David that climate change is probably in pretty precarious shape right now, but he's going to achieve healthcare. He gave himself a B+, not in Jim's interview, and he came back, and I was surprised at that, because if he'd been grading me in my academic years, I might have been a serious contender for class valedictorian, because I think he was a little easy and soft on himself, and I was surprised that he didn't have the good job. I was not valedictorian, and it was never a threat to be, but I was surprised that he didn't say, I'll leave that to the ultimate authorities.
At Harvard, a B+ is practically an F.
I was going to say,
inflation is so bad.
Great inflation, it is. It's a generational thing. The interesting thing to me is this. His job rating today in the Gallup poll is 50% favorable. That's higher than that of Ronald Reagan, who went on to win 49 states 3 years later. And it's lower by 21 points than George Herbert Walker Bush, and lower by 10 points than Jimmy Carter was at this time, both of whom were denied a second term. So when he talks about the long term, he's talking about 2012, whereas Democrats who are nervous right now are on the ballot in 2010.
Was it a good year for American politics?
Not exactly. We've had a bad decade for American politics.
You're going decade.
Maybe a bad 2 centuries. But aside from that, it's been fine.
2 centuries.
No, I mean, the anger, especially after healthcare, is worse than ever. He promised, a new age. We're not red America. We're not blue America. That part hasn't exactly worked out. Not his fault, particularly. Congress, I mean, as long as you've got a Congress run by John Boehner and Nancy Pelosi, you're going to have a partisan Congress. As long as you promote your leadership on the basis of fundraising, you're going to have this. And so I don't particularly blame him, but it hasn't worked out.
Bad, good year, indifferent year?
It was not a happy year. I mean, the pledge of the campaign to be transparent obviously couldn't be fulfilled on health care, or to the degree it was a problem, and to bring a new era in Washington. I think that's the biggest disappointment. I do not fault the president for that. I think that is a decision that has been made. On the other side, the House has never been a place of great collegiality. Nancy Pelosi did, I think, a remarkable job in passing climate change and passing health care. But the Senate is really a far more brutal place than it's ever been. They have used the filibuster more in this session of Congress, Jeffrey, than they did in the entire decade of the 1960s, when we were changing civil rights laws. Yeah, that is really, I think, a commentary when everything has to get 60 votes. I mean, a Mother's Day resolution has to get 60 votes at this time. Right?
All right, that's a bit of a bummer, but to end the year on.
Yeah, well, David,
when we next gather,
George III was a little concerned about that.
All right, we next gather, it'll be a new year, new decade. For now, happy holiday. Thanks a lot.
Thank you
Merry
very
Christmas.
much.